Hello, this will be part two in a series looking at cornerstones and the ceremonies surrounding them. I'll put the link a couple other links in the description, but also did a video on grain, oil and wine, and that is very strongly connected to cornerstone ceremonies. And just like the cornerstone, grain, oil and wine is mentioned in many times in the Bible, for instance, and other ancient references. And all, for instance, the Temple of Solomon and the labourers who worked on this. Now, the Temple of Solomon being very important, not in the both the Old and then New Testament as well, but also in Masonic tradition. But the wages of the labourers were paid in grain, oil, and wine, and this is like a gift box that Masons achieve as they move up through to a certain rank. So it's still very important for especially Judeo-Christian tradition, and now in modern Masons. Now, Orthodox funeral ceremonies, they pour oil and wine and then grain into during funerals, but the cornerstone ceremony is very important when building a new church or cathedral. And for instance, the importance, now this will also link back to Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, or the three columns, the man, the woman, and the virgin, but also to the various wardens and the Grand Master, for instance, in Masonic lodges. Here's an example of a cornerstone ceremony, rededicating to celebrate their, was it the 125th ceremony? But again, the use of lifting gear as well, nice touch. But the cornerstone laying ceremony, testing the stone by plumb, level, by square, level, and plumb. We'll have a look at that. Also consecrating the stone with corn, oil, and wine, and cementing the stone. Now we'll touch on these again in later videos. Now we'll be, if you can get your hands on it, you're interested in architecture. Say this book, Building Lives, Constructing Rites and Passages by Neil Harris. Basically the story how buildings have like a lifespan. So they're from their design through to the cornerstone, the topping out ceremony, eventually through to their destruction or the tearing down of older buildings. How there's like a lifespan, but also rituals connected to this, and how this is mentioned also in several older, very ancient traditions as well. Now, okay, so all building is necessarily an act against nature, and again, with older traditions, you don't want to for instance, you want to design to appease angry gods. When you, just like feng shui, or in China, geomancy, it's important to do things correctly in the right procedures according to these very ancient traditions, which still live with us today in major public buildings. Now, this is an interesting part. So in the Roman world, towns were purified enclosures. Planners might consult the flight of birds, the motion of clouds, or the movement of stray animals to determine their precise sites and moments of establishment. Not just where, but also when you build them, just like feng shui. Holes were dug in the ground to hold good things or contain the earth transported by the settlers from elsewhere. Secret naming ceremonies were common. The cutting of furrows to mark town boundaries would be undertaken with a white cow and an ox yoked together. Now, an ox is a bull that's being castrated, just like a bullock, as we call them here in Australia. The whole population participated in these public events, producing a common experience that was reinforced and made retrievable by means of the created landscape, order itself, the pattern of its streets and shapes of its walls. Very important to geometry and these other aspects as well. But to begin with, so secret naming ceremonies were common. The cutting of furrows to mark town boundaries would be undertaken with a white cow and an ox yoked together. Here's a 1st century depiction of, I believe that's of it, but basically just to give you an idea of his picture. Now, earlier videos as well, I mentioned hermstones, which marked sacred precincts before, for instance, in Greek times and in basically around the Mediterranean world, and still happening now. For instance, the central Herma was relocated to the Medici gardens in Italy somewhere. I forget the exact location. Okay, so cornerstones there. Now, again mentioned in part one. So, for instance, cornerstones are referenced many, many times in the Old and New Testament. For instance, in the New Testament, Jesus Christ is himself the cornerstone, Ephesians 2. And so you'll find this inscription and the importance of cornerstone ceremonies in basically, especially Catholic and Orthodox, these older Christian traditions. Now, later on with the, especially the more Puritan forms of the Protestant religions, they didn't really like icons, they didn't like ceremony, they wanted to keep this very pure. So it's more of a, it's still, you'll still see it in some forms, but especially the more leaning towards the puritanical, I suppose you would say. I wish I could have a better word for it at the moment, but yeah, those types of Protestant churches was a bit frowned upon. And okay, so that's a long rant in itself, but okay, so now in the Old Testament, Isaiah 28 and cornerstones. So I've just cut out these sections, and this is interesting. We'll be focusing on these throughout most of this video. So you can pause and read it if you want. So I'll save some time and not read it out, but we'll be following it through. And so, behold, I am laying in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. So especially when they mention in the Bible, it's more in a spiritual sense, but just as with weights and measures is very dry, but I did a video a while back on the ethics and morality to do with weights and measures, how it's mentioned not just in the Bible, but the Egyptian Book of the Dead and many ancient traditions. Well, all of them, basically, the importance of these things. But so beginning with this, so behold, I am laying in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. He who believes will not be in haste. And that's also, shouldn't do these things quickly and have to be done at the right time and done properly. Do you want it done right, or do you want it done right now? And as an example, Missouri state capitol building. Not only what do we have? We have this, the caduceus. This is a measuring wand, a measuring of a wand or of a measuring rod. This is the origin of this particular item. And we also have the cornucopia. So again, the cornucopia, I did a series on those, and in earlier videos I'll try to remember to put the links in the description in regarding the ethics and morality of weights and measures. So in a spiritual sense, the importance of being honest in your weights and measures, and how that also applies to living a good life. And being true, being honest. For instance, when you measure honestly. If you're not doing, you're cheating people if you're not honest, and especially, well, weights and measures. So the Capitol, Missouri State Capitol as one example. This is from 1915, the ceremony, and this was especially back in the day, parades, processions before, radio, television, and this sort of stuff. So this was a big public event, and the whole town would participate in laying these cornerstones. And there are very, very strong connections to, well, the Grand Lodge of Missouri, free and accepted Masons as well. So that's ancient free and accepted Masons. So there was a rededication of this stone and the ceremony that goes with it, and you can see like the local lodge and again the local lodge, Prince Hall, Grand Lodge, and so what do we see there? And we'll be looking at that. So behold, a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone. So firstly, we test the stone. It's always been tested with a square. So we see two squares here being applied to make sure the stone is square. It's a square deal. It's a square house. This is still an important reference in our terminology now. And tested with the level. And so this is to test that, the stone is level across the top. And so we can see these tools in here in these masonic tracing boards. And there we see that as well. Now, it's not just testing the level across the top, but it's also along the sides, and so we can test that with a plumb as well. So there, And so we test the top of a stone, and we know that it's square. Not only is it square, it's on the level. And so there we see from Isaiah 28. And this is a very interesting piece. Now, Isaiah 28:17, I will make justice for line and righteousness for plummet. So what's a plummet? It's a plumb line for plummet. Plummet is to fall, but what is a line falls down? So that's where this origin of this word as well. Now it's interesting. Well, for instance, Amos 7:7, he showed me, behold, the Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line and a plumb line in his hand. What do you see? A plumb line. Behold, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of the people of Israel. It's, that it's square, it's honest. This is one of the references, what they're suggesting here. This is a plumb line, like just a piece of art, but well, the compass. This is another important tool regarded to this. And we see the temple precinct there in the background and the plumb line. Now, this is a very practical, still used all around the world. So all, to make of the wall, testing the wall with a plumb line. This is still done today. It's one of the best ways to do it. Now, this also connects to ancient Egypt. So there is no shortage of plumb lines. It's very well known. They're basically all over the place. This is a merkit. We see the plumb line hanging. So it's not only it's also suggested, and well, for good reasons, because I've done some videos on pendulums, which are essentially a plumb line and how they are used to measure time. So plumb lines are not just for measuring measuring a wall that it's straight. It's also a useful timekeeping device. A pendulum, the length of a pendulum defines how long the swing is, and so it doesn't matter the weight of a pendulum, as long as it's the length is what counts. So, especially if you want to measure or anything, and also time. So measuring multiple things with this one particular item. Now, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, for instance, spell 125, again, the importance of honest weights and measures throughout the Bible, but again, going back to ancient Egypt, I have not reduced the measuring vessel, I have not reduced the measuring cord. You're measuring your weights properly and you're measuring your length properly. I have not encroached on the fields, I have not added to the pan of the scales. You're not cheating. I have not tampered with the plumb bob of the scales. Again, you're keeping accurate weights and measures. And I have not taken milk from the mouth of babes. So, again, honest weights and measures, we're in this sort of POMO world where anything goes, as long as you're, has unbelievable quote I heard from someone who I expected a lot more of, said that long it's, it's an entrepreneurial spirit and unbelievable the lack of ethics and morality. And we just see, this is one of the reasons why, got to keep your ethics, you've got to be true, and weights and measures, and that also accounts for your morality, spirituality, and this is why it's a constant cross-time, cross-cultures, cross the world, except not so much these days, as long as you're making money. UN Security Council building, I've seen Scott Onstott's Secret in Plain Sight, he and some others as well, David Overton I think as well. This mural in the Security Council building, very interesting. For instance, the Vesica there, the Phoenix, and very symbolic, very interesting. But just outside the security hall by Zanetti. Now I forget the name of this actual mural, but this is just outside. And what do we have? The plumb line, and in the center again, being honest, keep a square deal and a straight deal, and also of course applies to construction on a level, a plumb. Also, well, we see it in ancient masons. For instance, this is an aqueduct in Rome. All these tools again, and the plumb, and also the square and the plumb line as well. Piranesi is what this is the illustration. The tools of the builder, the compass, and well, the plumb line as well for measuring and doing a good and accurate job and living a good, accurate, decent life as well. Okay. Isaiah 28:25, when he has leveled its surface. It's also an interesting reference. There are many others, but just this particular one focusing on this these passages. Now, it's also interesting, so back to especially New Jerusalem, as it's called, and the weights and the measurement systems embedded therein, for instance, 144 cubits. Did a series on hermeticists such as John Dee, Edmund Gunter, and others, and for instance, in this version it's 12,000 stadia. In the new King James version, it's 12,000 furlong. 1 furlong is 660 feet, or 10 chain, which was the chain, in inverted commas, invented by Edmund Gunter, and how that is, it's 33 feet times 2. But how from there all these lovely numbers come. But New Jerusalem, and he talked to me. And he who talked to me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and its walls. So a measuring rod, or a wand, or a reed is another word for it as well. And I'll just bring that up in this particular one, because dill is beaten out with a stick and cumin with a rod. And why a stick and why a rod? Not certain there, but it's an interesting one. Also, the references to wheat and grain as well are nice, but not necessarily 100%, but just as I mention them, because behold, I am laying in Zion for a foundation to test it. Well, the references to the stick and the rod, and throughout these as well. So magic wands, the caduceus, measuring rods. And for instance, for instance, John Dee, but back to the Missouri State Capitol building, the caduceus literally translates in Greek for wand to a measuring rod, in the cornucopia once more. And also this portion of the boat, the anchor, just so much of connected there to, especially to some recent uploads, but older ones I'll try to put in the description, links to it. Which brings us back to Building Lives by, forget the author's name for a moment, Neil Harris. And when he's referencing, and he also talks about Mayan and ancient India, and they have very similar, if not identical, practices. But this particular one, where the Romans would mark out the town with a furrow, so they would plough around, and this ceremony of marking out the sacred precinct, was so important to setting up a town and to survey. And this is another important connected theme to cornerstones. And so in Isaiah 28, does he who ploughs for sowing plough continually? He has levelled its surface, and barley in its proper place, and spelt as the border. So they're creating a border, just like this Roman practice of setting out your town with this particular ritual of a white ox and a cow. And again, throughout the Bible, the importance of measuring your fields, and even practice of, for instance, any grain which you did not harvest and sort of fell to the ground, those who were landless were able to pick from that grain, and travellers who were moving along it was okay to, just for instance, if you're walking along and you can reach out and grab an apple off the tree as you're travelling. These were sort of laws which people who had land were expected to allow this type of thing to happen. But again, in Isaiah 28, and this a nice connection link there, and I'll do some in the next series, because there's more than a few references in these ancient texts, especially the Bible, an Egyptian Book of the Dead, for instance, and again, they're connected to the importance of honest weights and measures, morality, and good ethics, which is also a theme for, as I say, Freemasons are trying to make good men better. Now, another feature, so in Roman worlds, purified enclosures, planners would consult the birds, motion of clouds, just like feng shui, where you're looking for the right place for the right time. But also, holes were dug in the ground to hold good things or contain the earth transported by settlers from elsewhere. Well, this brings us back to cornerstones because it's a standard practice in cornerstone rituals to include a time capsule, which will include, so for instance, George Washington Monument in Baltimore. This was a excavated cornerstone, and what they found in there were wine, old newspapers, good things, and the whole population participated in these public events, producing a common experience that was reinforced, etc., etc. So in his address, April 17th, 1789, George Washington noted, "The tokens of regard and affection which I have often received from the citizens in this town were always accepted because I believe them always sincere." Well, so what good things would be put into this, and they were accepted with, they were sincerely given. And again, so if you want to go a little bit further into this, but time capsules, cornerstones, all come together in these ceremonies. George Washington, famous Mason, of course, but also very, very interested in surveying. He was like, that was, for instance, Lachlan Macquarie here in Australia, pretty much our equivalent, did the same thing. Now, why is survey important? Just like the ox and the cow measuring out that sacred precinct, which brings us back to the hermstones, which show the borders of the sacred precinct, so especially a temple, and the area around it would be marked out by Hermes. Well, that also applies to surveying, measuring, and okay, I mentioned earlier chain and furlong. Well, this is a chain. This is literally a chain that's 66 foot, also called the surveyor's chain or the Gunter's chain, which was used throughout Australia, Canada, and America. But also, why is surveying important? And cornerstones, for instance, well, across the ancient world, this is in Ostia, in Italy. But you need to survey your cornerstone and have it properly aligned, because from that the rest of the building is made. And so you need to survey it right, you need to do it accurately to begin with. Another connection to cornerstones. And cementing the stone as well. So this is the laying of a cornerstone, Masonic temple in New York. He is, well, the time capsule as well on the inside, but also cementing the stone with the trowel. And what do we have? He's holding the trowel in this particular Masonic illustration. But what do we also have? The level and the plumb, and of course the compass and square as always. So what do we have? These cornerstone laying ceremonial instruments, well, again, standard, depicted from ancient times as well. So now also in the book Building Lives by Neil Harris, he mentions how, especially in America, so pretty much across the world, the importance of cornerstone ceremonies and rituals had diminished. But it was especially in America and through Freemasonry that these public events and or at least the inclusion of public, because for instance the cathedrals, the common people weren't so much encouraged to, it was something more for the elite. But with the American Republic and the growth of that particular schools of Freemasonry there, it became an important feature, communal feature, to bring these things in. And so the Statue of Liberty, well, this was the ceremonial trowel for cementing the stone, one of these important features. So if I go back to especially the grain, oil and wine ceremony, but yeah, the Long Pine Lodge and the rededication of the stone there, testing the stone, square, level and plumb, as we saw, consecrating the stone with corn or grain, oil and wine. In America it tends to be now corn, because maize, that being very American, but they did not have corn back in Solomon's time, for instance. It was grain or wheat, and cementing the stone. So this feature, just a refresher of where I started with these things. So we've seen these already. Yes, but this ceremony and these instruments, very important. Part one, I mentioned, for instance, St. Mary's Catholic Cathedral. We have these, the square, the trowel, and the mallet, which is once the stone's set, it's tapped 3 times with a mallet, which is another part of this. And of course, the square, or the level, the plumb line, but the trowel, the mallet, and the square. We see these as well. So it's okay. And so Masonic are especially very important, not just in their lodges, but in courthouses, major parliament buildings, capitol buildings. It was and still is something that they specialise in, and they're invited to come and conduct these types of ceremonies because they have a long history of it. They retain and remember the ancient craft and those ceremonies, rituals, and so forth that go with it. And okay, so that's the end of this part, but I will have more to come, but just to extend and show and to demystify some of it, because it tends to be, especially on the internets, it's all demons or but it's actually part of our common cultural heritage, and I'm using being raised in from let's call it a Christian culture. So these stories are very even if I'm not a believer, so to say, let's call it, but still the stories are very important. They retain, they're part of my cultural heritage, but also you can find it in other not just in like other Christian groups, but across the world, across cultures, and even so it's very important. These stories are part of our history, but also weights and measures, especially with of course something I'm very fascinated with, and also construction. So it's part of an ancient science in that way as well. The builders of the temples, the cathedrals, were the scientists, the engineers, the intelligence, the very scientific people of their time. And we need to remember this. We need to pay attention to this, because it's not just spiritual, ritual, superstition. There are also practical, real world important applications for these types of things. And as Rudyard Kipling said, if we remembered history in the form of stories, we would never forget. So again, these stories, it's a good way to pass knowledge on. You don't have, And so with that, I hope you enjoyed this part. There'll be more to come. I'll put links in the description, especially I think one of is one of, I forget the exact name, morality and mythology, morality and myth in the importance of weights and measures, and how, being ethical is one of these common themes amongst these organisations, these older texts, and something we're losing, unfortunately. Yep, so okay, with that, hope you enjoyed and have a good one. Links in the description.